Hello and welcome back. In the last episode we made the fretboard and we put the inlays in, dug the holes for the inlays. So this time it's time to start cutting it to size and putting the frets in. It's been a number of hours now and this is set. It's kind of pretty hard, it's not sticky anymore. So, and as you can see, it looks a right old mess. So I've got my sanding block again with some, I think this is 80 sandpaper. What I'm going to do is start to sand that down, and what I'm going to be doing this time, I'm not going to be changing the board itself, but I'm going to be just bringing these mother of pearl things back in and taking the glue off. Now, both the glue and the mother of pearl is something I don't want to be breathing in. Not that you want to be breathing in any sort of dust, to be fair. So I'm going to wear a mask and very carefully going to start to see what it comes up like. So there's been a lot of sanding and you can see that is now absolutely smooth, and you can see if I focus in, some of the bits where there were big gaps are now pretty well hidden. I think once I sand that with some finer sandpaper, that will hide any of these errors. So that's looking not too bad. Now, unfortunately what I do have, I've got a little mark here where the plane dug in while I was planing it down. Because of the way the grain works, you get this sometimes on rosewood, and that looks a mess. So I'm going to try and fill that. What I'm going to do is put some super glue in it, and then I've still got some of this dust left over, so super glue and dust. Epoxy and dust is good, but it takes like at least a day to dry enough to sand it. So super glue, hopefully that'll give me some sort of results in a few minutes. So I've got my dust ready in a little pot there. Let's pop some glue on here, just in a stripe down there, and then let's gently put the dust on it. Now, obviously there's a lot of dust here. I should try and rescue some of it. Alright, I'll give that a good 10 minutes or so and then I'll come back and take the dust off. To get the dust off, I've just got a very fine paintbrush. I could just hoover it away, but then obviously I won't be able to save it, because you never know if there's any other corrections I need to make. Obviously I could make more dust, I've got some of this wood left over, but there we go. And you can see what's left there, and now I'll get my sandpaper again and I can just take that down. What I'll do is use a bit on a block so that I don't start to wear away too much, because I'm a bit concerned about how thick this is going to end up. If I keep sanding and sanding, I'm going to end up with something that's too thin to actually use. So, and there we are. I hope you can see that. Let me dust it off a little bit. That mark has now completely gone. I can't see it at all. So that's a good result, because I've got a bit more down here as well. It's looking a mess, so I shall do the same to that, and then I'll just inspect the whole rest of it in case there's any more lurking, and that'll be job done. So now the next grade I've got is 240, and I'm just using this on a normal block. I reckon now it's getting this fine, it's probably not going to affect the shape too much. And what I did, I just measured this, and it's starting to get down. It's like a fraction of a millimetre thinner than it should be already, so I've gone quite far with that, and that's why I allowed a mil or so when I did the original thickness. So I've gone, it took a bit more to sand these down than I thought, and it's taken more off the board, but I can still see the marks where I cut the frets, so that's the main thing. Now, all this sanding, I'm going to be wearing a mask. And this next one is 400. Now 400 I find is the time when it really starts to make a difference. really starts to feel smooth. Now I've got this cheap, but it's a funny shape. It doesn't really fit on the block, so perhaps that was a mistake. Let's try it like that. The one thing you'll notice, I've sanded away lots of the ridges where the frets are going to go, so I need to re-dig those. So I'll get the fret saw out again and let's start doing that. Now I've left this square, which means I can put my set square against it on this edge and make sure as I recut those that I'm cutting them square to the edge. Now I've measured the frets that I'm going to use in terms of the depth. I've measured this bit here and has set in my saw to that. Now I've got the fret saw here, it's got holes, and I've clagged a bit of wood on the back of it to give me that depth with some holes in it. So by adjusting that I can set the depth. I'm going to set it just a bit more. So this I measured at about 1.7 depth. This I'm going to set it at about maybe just a bit more than 2. So we've got 2.2 there. 2.2, so I think that's probably about right. Too shallow, the frets won't sit properly. Too deep and you'll have a big gap underneath. So I think that will probably do. And we'll now redo the frets. So there we go, that's all the frets recut. But of course, if we focus in, what's happened, and I'd forgotten about this, is that the bit on the saw, the wood on the saw, when it gets to depth, actually marks the fretboard. I forgot about that. So what I should have done is to just sand it down to the 400 and then go through the grades. So what I'm going to have to do is go through all the grades again. So I'm going to have to sand that down with 400 and that will shift that. It's only like a polished mark, it's not a gouge or anything. I'm going to have to sand it back and go through all the grades again. So once I can do that, then I can take the whole thing off the board. Now the next thing to do is to figure out and to cut it so that it's the right size and shape. I've left it a little bit over length on this end, but this end is right up to the nut, so I'll cut a bit off here. Then I also need to put the taper in. Now I know that at this nut end I've got 42.85 is the overall width. Now I'm going to have 2 lots of binding either side of this, so that binding is 1.5 mil. So I need to take 3 millimeters off this in order to get the size of the actual fretboard. So 42.85 minus 3 is going to be about 40, isn't it? I'll do the actual calculation in a second. So I do the calculation, I get 39.8, and then if I divide that by 2, 19.9 or thereabouts. If I now set my gauge to 19.9, I can mark off from the middle. So now I need to know what the depth is here, so I can set my marker gauge to measure that depth exactly, the one that I marked on earlier on. Okay, so that's that depth. Now I know that that's not going to be in the middle, which actually it's not far off, it is pretty much in the middle. So that's the depth from which I need to subtract my 19.9. So let's measure that depth. It's quite easy on these, you can just use this end bit to do it. That depth is 32.14. Let's write that down. 32.14. If I subtract my 19.92 from it, and that difference gives me 12.22. So if I now set this to 12.2 or thereabouts, I can set my depth gauge to that. So we are there, and I can then mark off 12.2 here with my depth gauge, and that should now give me, if I measure it, that should give me the depth that I'm looking for, which is that original 19.9, which in fact it does. And then I've used my white pencil to just mark those on here so I can see them a little bit better. So now I've marked both ends with the width of the board that I need. I've double checked the maths just to make sure I've got it right, and I've just slightly brought the marks round onto the end. Now the next thing is to draw in the lines, but of course this is a little bit too long, so I need to cut that off first. So I need to really extend these lines parallel until they get to the point where I cut it off. But the first thing to do is to measure the board to cut it at the right length. And now the end is cut off, giving it a little bit of a sand. That's now to length. And what I've done, the little marks that I made for the widths at both ends, I can now join those up, and I have joined them up with a long ruler and a pencil. Now you can just about make out those marks if I get the light right, but they're quite hard to see. So what I'm going to do is take my sharp white pencil, and these pencils are not very good, they're like China graph. They're quite hard to get a point on. As sharp as I can, I'm going to draw another line just to the outside of this so that I can see it. But the pencil line is the mark, if you like. So here we go. So I'll just cover the pencil mark like that, and I'll draw my white line. And then that is the line I'll cut to on the bandsaw. And that ensures that I'll get a little bit there left. I'll probably to the side of it as well, because what I want to do is then plane it down to the final size. There we go, and you can see the white line, or you might be able to see the white line is just to the side of the pencil line, and that's what you can imagine what it'll look like. So over to the bandsaw and let's trim that down. I'm going to have to be especially careful here, because any mistakes and I'm going to ruin the whole thing that's taken me weeks to get done. So carefully now, I've got a nice fine blade in it, and I'm going to cut just fairly to the waist side of that white line. And I've measured it a couple of times to make sure the dimensions are correct before I cut. Finally, very carefully, just gently grip this in the workmate. I can take a plane, my only plane, and then we can just start to carefully bring that down to the line. This is going to take a while. Be very, very careful as I approach that line. And I'm going to have this set so it just takes some off. Keep going until that's down to the line. Now what I'm finding, it's really hard to see the line when I'm planing to it. So I'm going to try putting a bit of tape along it. Pull the tape nice and tight. I can put that right close up to the line, and that'll give me a distinct straight edge. So there we are, that's most of the fretboard done. Cut to its right size so we can fit it into the shot. Feels very thin, but obviously I'm going to be adding an extra 3mm when I put the edges on. But as I said before, there's a decision to put the frets in now and have to cut the outsides, cut the bindings around it, or to put the bindings on, plane them down and stick the frets on the top. And yeah, and as I said last time, I'm going to have to do the difficult version because that's how they were. Okay, that'll be next. That'll be after I do the frets anyway. So before doing the frets, what I like to do is look at all the little notches along the side and make sure they're all consistent. If I see one that looks shallower than the others, it may be that I haven't cut the thing deep enough, because what you don't want to do is knock a fret in and it doesn't go all the way in, it leaves a gap. Looks a mess, and it'll be higher than all the others. So looking down, these look pretty much okay, so I can move on and start thinking about putting the frets on. And this is all the stuff that we need for doing the frets. Now I've been cheap and I bought ready cut frets. I know it's no good, it's not the purest way of doing it. You can buy it just in reels, essentially in big loops, but I just bought a pack off eBay, to be honest. And they are bent slightly more than we need, and that's what we need, because that'll be useful later on. Because what we do when we put the fret in is tap it in either end, and then you get a lump in the middle. And as you tap the middle, so the tangs on here, then as it sinks in, as it bends in, the tangs dig in, so the ends haven't got a way of directly, they don't have a direct path to pull back out, so there's less likely that they will lift. And what I like to do is put a bit of glue on as well. So a bit of just a little bit of aliphatic, and that'll just basically seal the hole. So I put a bit of water in, put a bit of glue in, and then put the fret in. And because there's water in there, it'll thin the glue, and the glue will flow all around, and it'll just sort of, obviously it won't glue onto the metal because you know it's wood glue. But what it'll do is just seal around, it'll kind of solidify it around those tangs, and it'll just mean that there's nowhere for them to go, and it's more likely that they'll stay in place. That's the theory anyway. So I'll show you on one of them what I do. I have a wet piece of kitchen towel, so I can just squeeze some water out of that into the gap there, like that, and then a bit of aliphatic. Oops, not usually that much. And then I can just make sure that's gone in. I have to give that a wipe. So I've just got, you can see a yellow stripe there. Take me fret, stick it in the middle. This is like a rubberized hammer. You can buy them, and it just basically rubberized so it doesn't damage the fret, and you just tap it at either end, make sure it's in, and then bash it in the middle, and that should be in. And you can then check that it's in all the way and it's not left a gap, and that's what we're going to do all the way along. Obviously then we can clean up any glue that's squeezed out of there. And one of the things you can do as you're doing the frets, you can look down it and make sure that you can't see any high ones, because the plan is to get them all the same. So each one you look carefully to see if it's seated properly, and then occasionally look down here. What you probably find on a thin piece of wood like this, see how I've started to get a bit of a bow coming on it? That's because you're forcing metal into these gaps that are slightly too small, and it kind of forces them apart, and if you add them all together you get a bit of a bow. That's okay. It's also because we put water in as well, and that's going to expand on that side. As long as we put a weight on it when it's done, while it dries, it doesn't matter, because what we're going to be doing is fixing it onto a fairly solid neck, and the whole thing is pretty bendy at this thickness anyway, so that's not a problem as long as it doesn't twist. That's the main thing. So now that's had a chance for the glue and the water to dry, and as you can see, the bendiness is pretty much gone. There's a tiny, like a millimetre or something in it, so that's much better. So the next thing to do is to start to trim off, because we've got all these extra long ones. It's going to be rather difficult to play. So what you need is a pair of these things. So side cutters, and they've got a bearing at the top here and very long handles, which makes it quite easy. You take one of these, because it's a side cutter, if I can get it in the shot, it's quite easy to sort of get really close to the end, and then pretty easy you just snip them off. So what you don't want is to be struggling and pull these out again. So it's just a case of going down and clipping off all these stick it out bits. So now that those are all trimmed off, what I need to do is to smooth them down so they're all level, because obviously the clippers don't quite get down right down to the right place. So laborious job with a file, and because if you file it kind of lengthways, it's possible to file just the metal, so kind of like that, and I'm pushing it towards the fretboard so that I'm not forcing any of the frets away. That's what you don't want, to unseat them. So it's just some time spent with a file. And now that they're all filed flat and level with the sides of the fretboard, the next issue is we've now got burrs on them where we've been doing the filing. What you're going to need is one of these. It's a triangular file, but one of the sides has been ground flat, so I can rub it against the fretboard and it won't cut into the fretboard, which means I can take each one of these individually, make sure I get the smooth side down, and I can just clean up those burrs so we're not getting a sharp edge on. Now I don't want to take it too far, because obviously we're going to be putting the binding up against that, so we don't want a gap, but we just want to take off that sharp edge. Okay, so that's the frets in. Now it's time to start thinking about putting the binding around the outside of the fretboard. That's going to be a challenge, but not going to do it this time, going to do it next time. So hope that one was useful, hope it was interesting. Give me a like if you liked it, and press subscribe if you want to, and maybe I'll see you next time.